Even in an era of prison reform, Massachusetts has lagged behind much of the country on issues of incarceration. The state prison system is currently under federal investigation, in part due to its treatment of ill and elderly inmates. As you may know, the importance of compassionate release is an issue we've talked a lot about on the show, and one former House Speaker, Sal DeMacy, discussed with us after he was granted release from federal prison in 2016, after years of fighting for it because of his age and stage 4 cancer diagnoses. At the time, he told us he thought he would die in prison, and there were so many more just like him.
But Bureau of Prisons does not provide the health care needed, not only just for me, but for anybody. I can give you examples of the inhumane and cruel treatment that was in prison for lack of medical care. Every other day, someone in my unit would die, and they would do nothing about it, nothing.
When DeMacy was released, Massachusetts still did not have a compassionate release program on the state level, but he and his wife Debbie were among those who kept pushing. And when the state finally did pass a law last year, it was one of the last 5 in the country to do so, and yet very few people have since benefited. So where's the disconnect? Joining me to discuss are Jenifer McKim, senior reporter for the New England Center for Investigative Reporting at GBH. It's good to see you. And John Reinstein, an attorney and prison advocate. John, it's good to see you too. Give me the short version. Who qualifies under our state law for medical parole, compassionate release, whatever you want to call it for it?
Well, there are really 2 categories, Jim. The first category is prisoners who are terminally ill, which is defined as not expected to live longer than 18 months. And the second category is prisoners who are either physically or mentally incapacitated. And the showing for both types of cases is that they must be so debilitated that they no longer pose a threat to public safety.
How many have been granted? So this is, I think, April of 2018 that Governor Baker signed this. How many medical paroles, compassionate releases have we seen in the state?
The Department of Correction is not providing current statistics. When we were in court 2 months ago, they represented that 4 people had been released so far. One of those was one of my clients. There's one other I know by name, and I can't confirm the 4th.
You know, why did it take 40? Well, this is one of the most progressive states, allegedly, in America. Why did 45 states beat us to the punch on the underlying law to begin with, Jen?
Well, I think it's the state. Yeah, you're right. We're a very liberal state, and yet very conservative when it comes to criminal justice. We've heard this from John. You talk a lot about Willie Horton is a real reason why things really have never moved in the state.
Willie Horton. I mean, we actually have a piece of this commercial, which almost all of you have seen. In 1988, Willie Horton was this guy who was serving a life sentence here for murder. He was allowed on a weekend furlough, and during one of those furloughs, he went to Maryland and both raped a woman and stabbed her husband. Here is the commercial that we used against Governor Dukakis when he ran for president in 1988.
Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend.
So this lives 30 years later? Is it the residue, the residual impact of Willie Horton that is scaring legislators into doing anything, even with incapacitated inmates? So, let me start with you.
It was, I mean, yes, that was the start of it then, and also in 2010 there was another person who was released and also...
I remember.
Dominic Sinelli.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Killed a police officer, and so I think that's put everything completely on hold. Nobody wants to take that political risk of letting someone out.
Even though the statute makes clear if you continue to pose a risk, then obviously you're going to have this parole denied. Is that... Yes? No?
There is a subjective element to it, Jim. The commissioner gets to make a determination about whether you continue to pose a threat, but the standard that she's applied so far has been pretty rigorous, and that's one of the reasons very few people are getting out under this statute.
You know, Ruth Greenberg, who I know you're doing some work with, who was represented Alex Phillips, who was the first guy to get out in November of last year and died shortly thereafter, says the state's policy is delay, deny until they die. And one of the things she described, forget the hearing, is return to sender is the state's approach to this. If there's an alleged technical flaw in the application, even if it's filed by a layperson, an inmate, for example, the state just sends it back, and the time for there to be a decision doesn't even begin to run. Is that an accurate telling of this?
That's correct, and there's some other real problems with, with the procedure. Well, when you file an application for medical parole, you put in what you have, and for prisoners that may not be much. The law is fairly open as to what you have to file and who can file it for you. I mean, a friend, an attorney, a member, next of kin. The department itself has the authority to file for a petition for medical parole. It just doesn't do so. So last we heard they've filed one in a year.
So is this the issue that you have before the SJC? The whole issue of this?
The SJC is the pushback issue. You don't get in the door unless we think you've filed the right papers, and that now includes, by the way, you have to do it on the correct form.
So why did the legislature even, if it turns out that elected leaders or prison officials are nervous about granting compassionate release or medical parole, where did the legislature summon the courage to even
Well, I know
do
people
this?
like Senator Pat Jalen, they for years and years and years tried to get this passed.
That's one. They need a majority and a governor's signature.
So I think there was, we went and visited the jails. A lot of the sheriffs actually support this. There are people, because it's very, very expensive to take care of elderly and sick
You said somewhere in the
inmates.
neighborhood of $285,000
Exactly.
per inmate.
At the Shattuck Hospital,
Yeah.
that's about how much it costs a year. It's all studies show 2 or 3 times the amount of a regular inmate to take care of old folks. And so it's really whether or not you feel a moral reason that you should keep old people who are demented, who can't even remember the crimes they might have had, who then get buried in the cemeteries right by the prison. There's a cost to taxpayers.
Well, it's not just the moral reason. I know in the case of Alex Phillips, I mentioned the first to be granted compassionate release here. One of the victim's relatives, I know, was very unhappy about it. How relevant is the position of the victim or the survivors
Well, the question
to the
is whether
determination?
The question is whether that's being given too much weight. I mean, I've had 2 cases where I've been able to persuade the district attorney not to oppose, which makes an enormous difference. But if the
Wait, even though the victim or a survivor did oppose?
yeah, that's correct. In one case, the DA supported the release, even though the victims continue to oppose it. This is a case that took place 50 years ago, Jim.
The underlying case.
That's
You know,
right.
Ruth Greenberg also mentioned one of the hearings, I can't remember which one, where the person in charge kept cited at great length the governor's opposition to anybody who had a life sentence. Obviously, you don't even qualify if you're life sentence without parole, from what I understand.
No,
everybody
that's not
qualifies.
correct. Everybody,
What is- everybody-
What happened? What happened, Jim, was that there were competing versions that went through, but the legislature ultimately said everybody should get through. And one reason why they did that is that many of the long-term prisoners, many of the prisoners who are older and sick, are people serving life
So
sentences.
why is it even relevant at a hearing what the governor's position is? He signed the law, and if the law allows it, why is that even a relevant consideration?
Because the politics are still lurking out there. When the day this was signed, the governor said, "I don't like this. I don't want to let first-degree murderers out. So I am going to file new legislation that will exempt them from the
But
statute."
that hasn't passed.
It has never passed.
So, but I should have said this earlier. For the person watching at home, we mentioned that you mentioned a number of sheriffs support this for fiscal reasons. For the person sitting at home, why should they support the notion of somebody who's committed potentially a really horrible crime ever getting out of jail?
Well, it depends who you are. A lot of times, some people will question, is this the society we want or not?
Well,
So
what is the argument for it?
the argument for letting people
Yeah.
go? Well, because again, you have people some of them who are demented, they can't even remember what they did. Does it make sense to spend all that money, our taxpayer money, taking care of people who at some points don't even remember their crime, or statistics show at a certain age that they become much less dangerous. So we're just really punishing rather than
But
doing
there's a
anything
humanitarian
else.
part of this too. If it turns out they're going to die, an opportunity, if they don't pose a threat, to die with people who love them or people who are close to them is a pretty compelling factor too.
It is compelling. I mean, you brought up Alex Phillips. I did talk to
Who was
the,
a young man, by
He
the
was
way.
in his 30s, who was sick with cancer. I talked to the mother, who's the mother of the victim, and she said, "Hey, nobody gave compassion, to my son." But I also met him right when he got out, and he spent a couple weeks with his mother in his house before he died.
We only have 15 seconds left. Yeah, final thought, yeah.
Well, the thought is, the numbers are really quite extraordinary. Massachusetts has the highest percentage of older prisoners in the country. 25% of our prison population is over 50, and obviously that's getting older. And that costs a lot of money.
Keep us apprised of the litigation, John. Good to see you. Jen,
Thank you
appreciate
so
your
much.
time.